Massive floods have rocked Poland and our region. The International Monetary Fund was supposed to send a delegation to Moscow, but called it off after protests by Poland and other countries. And finally, former European Central Bank chief Mario Draghi recently released a scathing report on the EU's economy. These are the topics for discussion, for which I'm now joined by the Polish Deputy Finance Minister, Paweł Karbownik. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining me on World News tonight.
Pleasure.
So, starting with the massive floods in Poland, of course, we've been talking about this for ever since it's happened since last week. It looks like widespread damage and destruction. What are so far the estimates of how much this will cost, and how much will the Polish government contribute, to the aid and relief operations and ultimately to helping people recover?
I think it's a bit premature to estimate what could be the total cost of damages, because, as you know, the floods are still ongoing. So basically we are focusing on securing a budget for the necessary help for people who are affected immediately. So far we have secured 2 billion Polish zlotys. And obviously, we'll do whatever it takes to help those who have been hit by the massive floods.
Right. Is there a kind of ballpark? Is this potentially, could it be 10 billion zlotys? Or?
Well, you know, it's a natural disaster, so you can ask me. And so far, we see that the estimates are lower than what we have seen in 1997 in the massive floods that occurred in the region. So let's hope for the best, but obviously we have to be prepared for the worst. Right. So we are going through the budget, and we are ready for further transfers.
Okay, the IMF also was supposed to send a delegation to Moscow to what some were saying to resume business as normal. Poland protested this along with a few other countries and actually was successful in getting the IMF to call off this delegation. So can you tell us a little bit more about this, and what would have been the danger had this delegation indeed traveled to Moscow?
So indeed, we had a good discussion with the managing director of the IMF at the recent meeting of European finance ministers in Budapest, where this topic was brought up. And with a number of Nordic countries and Baltic countries, we were very skeptical about the idea. And as I understand, after this discussion, the managing director decided to postpone the mission or suspend the mission, given the risks that we have highlighted. And the basic risk was that the fund would be sent to Moscow and would be underwriting the Russian propaganda of economic success, which we obviously know is not the case, because the data that we know are coming from the Russian economy are different from what the regime is presenting. So there was a major risk that the fund would not be able to get proper verifiable data and would basically be a victim of the Russian propaganda.
Was there any risk of transfers to the Russian regime, perhaps in terms of money, because we know that their reserves are dwindling?
This was an economic mission. This was supposed to be an economic mission. So it was more about looking into the books normally there is a discussion and the fund gives advice. So we were also wondering what kind of advice would the fund give the Russian regime, how to run a war economy. I mean, it was a bit awkward. So we had this discussion among European finance ministers, and we are very, very pleased that the managing director took on board these concerns.
Okay, now moving on to Mario Draghi's somewhat scathing report talking about, about 5% of European GDP having to be redeployed into the European economy to help it keep pace with China and the United States. So how realistic is this plan? What are your thoughts on this?
I'm very happy that you brought up this number, 5% of GDP, because today the EU budget is 1% of GDP. So basically, we have a massive investment gap at the European level to finance the energy transition, digitalization, and last but not least, obviously, defense. So we are very happy that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has assigned Mario Draghi to prepare such a report. It's been published last week. And we hope that this will indeed reinvigorate debate in Europe to assist additional funds for those pressing needs like defense, energy transition, climate crisis, and digitalization. So there is a chance of things going forward in Europe because, as I've mentioned, he is advising the president, a newly elected president of the European Commission. So we shall see what comes out of this discussion, but certainly all the governments are now looking into the problem.
Now, which of those areas do you think is probably the most pressing one to invest in, if you had to choose?
Well, you know, coming from the region, I should say defense, obviously, and this is true, but I would also highlight the energy sector, because the major problem of the European economy these days are energy prices. So we pay 3 to 5 times more for gas than the Americans. We pay 2 to 3 times more for electricity than Chinese or Americans. So our economy is on a very disadvantageous position. So we have to do something about the energy market, investing in energy transition, in green transition, to sort out this structural problem. So I think the most pressing need is the energy sector.
The energy sector. Oh, I think it could be a good one. Well, I'm going to bring up this point. In defense, it seems like there's going to be an effort made to pool resources, right, to pull everyone together to get better defense contracts. Could the same thing be done in the energy sector?
So, you know, on the energy sector, it's funny because Prime Minister Tusk has proposed the so-called energy union 10 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. And this proposal indeed was about joint purchases of gas by Europeans. This idea has materialized to a very small amount, and there is already such a mechanism in the Commission, which is not very visible yet. But indeed, Draghi brings up this idea of Tusk from 10 years ago. So I think there is certainly, you know, a momentum. And when it comes to defense, it's exactly the same idea, to buy weapons at the European level, because it's cheaper, it makes sense, and we all have to rebuild our military arsenal.
Now, Draghi has suggested that Europe, it lost its competitive edge in one industry. We should not risk public money to regain it. The logic compels him to say, let's use what others produce better, like Chinese solar panels, for instance. So what's your take on that? Because we all see what happened with the tariffs on the Chinese EVs. They have some competitive advantage, but what about different products that fit the same goals of the green transition?
So I would say that, you know, with the Chinese, we have to aim for respecting common World Trade Organization standards. So it's about environmental standards, it's about labor standards. Basically, it's about level playing field, because what we are seeing now is that the Chinese are flooding the European market. And this is also a challenge for us, but it's also a risk for China, because if we stopped this flood by tariffs or other measures, basically with the hostility from the US, the Chinese do not have much opportunities to find another market. So we are not in a weak position here. And indeed, this kind of ideas to allow solar panels, but maybe regain competitiveness on the AI, which is certainly a key sector. These are interesting trade-offs, but I don't think that we are there yet. It's a beginning of the discussion, and certainly during the Polish presidency we'll have these discussions.
Mm-hmm. Now, many ideas put forth by Draghi require more coordination between member states, which in reality means giving more control to Brussels. An energy union, as you mentioned, common defense procurement, or the 28th regime for innovative startups. Now, do you think all of these things could be feasible and desired by the member states?
Does it require transfer to Brussels? I'm not sure. Because, for example, when we look at defense, certainly I don't see a transfer of power to Brussels. I see rather a cooperation among governments, and not all the governments of the European Union, because we have countries like Hungary, or we have neutral countries like Austria or Ireland or Malta who would certainly not be able to participate in these joint purchases. So when we are talking about pooling resources at the European level, we do not necessarily mean Brussels. We mean governments who are willing to join forces, a sort of coalition of the willing, and buy together for cheaper prices. And it doesn't have to be in Brussels.
Right, and that obviously makes sense. So back to Draghi's 800 billion euro per year proposal to put Europe on the right track, most of it being private capital, and half of that sum going for energy transition. So how feasible is this, and how likely is it that private money can be mobilized, right? Because I mean, it somewhat requires the free hand of the free market.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And we can try to attract private savings from Europe, which are now fleeing to the US because the returns on those investments are higher in the US. And we are doing that. Among finance ministers, we have a discussion how to attract capital, private capital, venture capital to Europe. We are also working in the government to attract private capital and boost equity capital into the Polish economy so that it creates innovation. So this is a process that is happening now. But if you ask me about the numbers and if all the private money is able to cover that amount, certainly not. I mean, we know we've started our discussion from 5% of GDP. Private money would cover 1-2% max. So certainly there needs to be a mixture of private and public money.
All right, well, it's a very ambitious plan that Mr. Draghi has, but it's definitely raised lots of good questions for us to discuss here.
It's very ambitious indeed, yeah.
Yep. Paweł Karbownik, Polish Deputy Finance Minister, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for watching, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.